When my parents told me we were moving to a house in the middle of nowhere, I wasn't thrilled. I was 13, used to the noise and busyness of the city, and the idea of living in some rural areas sounded awful. The house was way off the beaten path, surrounded by thick woods and a long dirt road that twisted through miles of trees. It was the kind of place that got so dark at night, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But my parents insisted it would be a fresh start. At first, things were pretty quiet. Our dog, Max, seemed to love the space, running through the fields and barking at the birds. My parents seemed happy too, busy with unpacking and fixing things up. But after a few days, Max started acting weird. He'd stand at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness, growling low like he saw something I couldn't. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just some animal. But then he started doing it every day, always at the same time, right around dusk. One evening, while I was sitting on the porch, I noticed Max growling again. I followed his gaze into the woods, and that's when I saw him. Just a shadow at first, standing between the trees. It looked like a man, tall and still, just watching. My heart sped up as I squinted, trying to see more clearly, but when I blinked, he was gone. I told my dad about it, but he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a hunter or a neighbor passing through. A few nights later, things got even stranger. We'd been hearing noises, branches snapping, footsteps crunching just beyond the tree line. My dad started keeping a baseball bat by the door, and I could tell he was on edge. One night, he decided to check it out. He took Max with him and disappeared into the woods, flashlight cutting through the dark. I watched from the window, my heart pounding as I waited. After what felt like forever, he came back, his face pale. "Did you see anything?" I asked. He just shook his head and muttered, "It's nothing. Just animals." But I could tell he was lying. That's when the nightmares started. Every night, I dreamed of the man, standing outside my window, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, like he was waiting for something. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, feeling like I was still being watched. I tried to tell my parents, but they said it was just me adjusting to the new place. New surroundings can feel unsettling, my mom said. But I knew it was more than that. There was something wrong with this house. The final straw came a few weeks later. It was late, probably around midnight, when Max started barking like crazy. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, and there he was standing just outside our yard, the man. He was closer now, his face barely visible in the moonlight. He didn't blink or move, just stared straight up at my window, his expression empty, like he was dead inside. I backed away, my hands shaking, and ran to wake up my parents. By the time my dad grabbed his bat and ran outside, the man was gone. Max was still barking, his fur standing up, but there was nothing, no sign anyone had been there. My dad paced the yard, shouting into the dark, but the only answer was silence. After that night, my parents finally started to believe me. They called the police, but all they found were some broken branches and footprints leading back into the woods. They told us it was probably just a drifter, someone passing through. But my dad wasn't convinced, and neither was I. We decided to move out not long after that. My parents said it was because of work, but I knew the real reason. We were all scared. Even Max refused to go near the edge of the woods again, sticking close to the house, as if something out there still frightened him. It's been years since we left that place, but I still think about it sometimes. I still see that man's face in my nightmares, his eyes staring through the dark like he could see straight into my soul. We never figured out who he was or what he wanted. All I know is whatever was out there in those woods, it didn't want us there, and we were lucky to get out when we did. When my wife and I bought the old house, we were excited. It had that classic charm, wooden floors, vintage fixtures, and an attic full of history waiting to be discovered. It was exactly the kind of place we had always dreamed of, and we felt lucky to have found it. During the first few days, we explored every inch, taking in the details and imagining how we'd make it our own. But then on the second floor, we found something unexpected, a door hidden behind a tall bookshelf. The door was small and oddly placed, as if someone had tried to conceal it. My wife looked at me, curiosity and a hint of unease in her eyes. "Should we open it?" she asked. I shrugged, tried to play it cool, but I felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. We moved the bookshelf aside and pulled the door open. Inside was a small room, completely empty, but there was something off about it. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the walls were painted a shade of red that seemed too dark, too deep. It felt like a place that didn't belong, like it was never meant to be found. We stood there for a moment, both of us silent, before my wife finally said, "Let's just leave it." I nodded, relieved to close the door and push the bookshelf back in place. We tried to put it out of our minds, telling ourselves it was just an old storage room. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something we shouldn't have disturbed. A few nights later, we started hearing noises. At first, it was just faint creaking like old wood settling, which seemed normal enough. But then the sounds grew louder, whispers, almost like someone muttering just out of earshot. My wife would wake up, saying she felt someone watching us, even though the room was empty. One night, as I walked down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, standing perfectly still near the door to that hidden room. I turned, but it vanished, leaving only that icy feeling lingering in the air. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was our minds playing tricks on us. But then came the visions. My wife would wake up in the middle of the night, swearing she saw a dark figure standing at the foot of our bed. I'd rush to turn on the light, but there was never anything there, just the cold, empty room staring back at us. One morning, I noticed scratch marks on the floor near the bookshelf, like something had tried to move it. We were scared, and we knew it was time to confront whatever was happening. One night, after another series of loud knocks and those unsettling whispers, we decided to face it head-on. We moved the bookshelf and opened the door again, standing together in front of that cursed room. The air felt colder, and the darkness seemed to press against the walls. I could see the tension in my wife's face, but we both stood firm. "Leave us alone," I whispered, my voice echoing in the empty space. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for anything to happen. But all we felt was that heavy silence. After that night, things seemed to calm down. The noises stopped, and the house felt still again. It was like the presence, whatever it was, had finally left. But even though the shadowy figure never returned, there's still something about that room. Whenever we pass it, I can feel the hair on my arms stand up, and the air feels colder, even on the warmest days. We keep the doors shut, and the bookshelf stays in front of it like a barrier between us and whatever lies beyond. We tell ourselves that it's over, that we've reclaimed our home. But deep down, I know that room will always feel wrong. Even with the shadow gone, the house carries a faint discomfort, a lingering reminder of something we might have never fully gotten rid of. I bought the house to make my boyfriend happy. He always talked about wanting to live in a place with character, something old with history. So when we found the old colonial house at the edge of town, I convinced myself it was perfect, even though something about it felt off from the start. It was cheap too, which should have been a red flag, but I brushed off the uneasiness creeping in the back of my mind. I told myself it was just the nerves of buying a new place. The first few weeks were okay. We spent our time fixing it up, painting walls, and rearranging furniture. But that's when the small things started happening. I'd walk into a room and find objects moved, a chair turned slightly, or a book on the floor. At first, I thought it was my boyfriend messing around or me just being forgetful. But one morning, I found a picture frame shattered on the kitchen floor. It was one of us, smiling and happy, but the glass was cracked right over my face. My boyfriend shrugged it off, saying it must have fallen, but it didn't sit right with me. Then came the messages. One evening, after he left for work, I was alone, painting one of the bedrooms. I stepped out for a few minutes to grab a snack, and when I returned, there were words scrawled across the wall in thick black ink. "Leave now." My heart nearly stopped. I called my boyfriend, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably some prank from when the house was on the market, or maybe I was just tired and seeing things. But I knew what I saw, and the paintbrush still wet in my hand told me I hadn't imagined it. The sounds followed soon after. It was always late at night, whispers so soft, they felt like they were coming from right beside me, yet there was no one there. Some nights, I'd hear soft tapping on the walls, like someone knocking, waiting for an answer. My boyfriend and I started arguing more, my nerves constantly on edge. He thought I was overreacting, that I was just stressed. One night, after a particularly heated fight, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I figured he just needed some space, but when he didn't come back the next day or the day after, I started to worry. His phone went straight to voicemail. It was like he'd vanished. Now I was alone in the house, and everything got worse. The whispers grew louder, and objects started moving right in front of me. Doors slamming shut, lights flickering on and off. I'd walk into a room and feel a chill sweep through me, like the house was alive, watching. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder, like a hand gripping me. I screamed, jumping up and spinning around. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty room. I knew then that whatever was in the house wasn't just a trick of my mind. It was real, and it didn't want me there. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed a bag and left, my hands shaking the whole time. The house seemed to sigh as I shut the door behind me, like it was relieved I was finally leaving. But even after I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still clinging to me, some invisible weight pressing on my shoulders. A few days later, I returned to pick up the rest of my things. I told myself it would be quick in and out, but as I walked through the empty house, I felt a deep, crawling unease. The air was cold, and every shadow seemed to shift, as if it was watching. When I got to the bedroom we had painted together, I froze. There, on the wall, written in the same thick black ink as before, was a new message: goodbye. I dropped my things and ran. I didn't look back as I sped away, leaving everything behind. I don't know what was in that house or what it wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel that cold hand on my shoulder and see those words on the wall. It was a warning, a final reminder that the house had let me go, but it wouldn't forget. And neither would I. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. I'd always dreamed of owning my own place, and when I finally signed the papers and moved into my first house, it felt like a huge milestone. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest two-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. The first few nights were peaceful, almost too quiet. I wasn't used to the silence after living in apartments for so long, but I figured it was just part of adjusting to life alone. About a week in, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body tense, like I'd been pulled from a deep sleep. I lay there listening, and that's when I heard it, footsteps moving slowly down the hallway. For a split second, my brain filled with a sense of calm. I recognized those footsteps. They sounded just like my dad's. Growing up, I'd always known when he was coming down the hall by the way his feet dragged just a bit. But then reality hit me, and my heart started to race. My dad had passed away 5 years ago. Whoever was walking down the hall, it wasn't him. I got up, my hands shaking as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed. As I crept out of my room, I could still hear the steps, now coming from the living room downstairs. I moved slowly, trying to stay quiet, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. I peered around the corner of the stairs, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing in the middle of my living room, wearing a ski mask. For a second, he just stood there like he was waiting for something. I felt frozen, my grip tightening around the bat. Then, without thinking, I shouted, "Hey, get out!" The masked man turned, and for a moment, our eyes locked. Even with the mask, I could tell he was just as surprised as I was. He bolted for the door, and I heard him crash through it, sprinting into the night. My adrenaline was through the roof, and I stood there breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as I started to calm down, I realized something else. There had been another set of footsteps. I'd only seen one guy, but there were 2 sets of footsteps. I swept through the house, every nerve on high alert, searching every room, every closet, every shadowed corner. But it was empty. Whoever else had been there was gone. The front door was wide open, the night air chilling the room. I called the police, and when they arrived, they searched the area but didn't find anything. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing. The officers told me it was probably just a break-in gone wrong, and that I was lucky they left without taking anything. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated, like my space, my safety had been ripped away. After the police left, I sat on the couch, my hands still shaking as I replayed everything in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that the other intruder had been watching me the whole time, hiding somewhere just out of sight. I kept thinking about those footsteps, how they had sounded so familiar at first. The idea that someone could move through my house, knowing exactly how to mimic the sound of my dad's steps, left me chilled to the bone. Now every night, I sleep with a knife on the nightstand and the bat still by my bed. I double-check every lock, every window, and leave the lights on downstairs. The house feels different now, like it's holding on to the memory of that night, reminding me that once someone gets in, the feeling of safety never fully returns. When I first moved into the old house, I was excited. It had the kind of charm that only comes with age: creaky floors, antique fixtures, and a porch that looked like it belonged in a movie. I made sure to set everything up just how I liked it and quickly fell into a routine. But almost immediately, I started noticing something strange. Every time I left the house, I'd make a point to lock the front door. But when I'd come back, it was often unlocked. I'd find the door slightly ajar. The lock turned. At first, I thought I was being forgetful, maybe distracted by all the moving stress. But after the fifth or sixth time, I knew something was off. I tried brushing it off, telling myself the door was just old and maybe the latch wasn't catching right. But deep down, I felt uneasy. I started double-checking the lock before I left, pulling on the handle to make sure it was secure. Yet somehow, it would still be open when I came back, like someone was inside, moving through the house when I wasn't there. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise coming from the basement, a low, rhythmic creaking, like wood groaning under weight. I froze, listening. It was a slow, steady sound, like something moving back and forth. It reminded me of a rocking chair. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up because I had thrown out an old rocking chair when I moved in. It had been in rough shape, so I left it by the curb for the trash. But now, that same sound was coming from my basement. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, my heart pounding with each step. The basement was cold, filled with boxes and old furniture from the previous owner. And there it was, tucked into a corner, a rocking chair, identical to the one I'd thrown out. It swayed slowly, creaking with each movement, even though no one was sitting in it. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there, staring at the chair, convinced I was seeing things. But then the creaking stopped. The chair stilled, as if it had sensed my presence. After that, the atmosphere in the house felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a presence I couldn't ignore. I tried to go about my daily life, but I always felt watched, like eyes followed me from room to room. One night, I was sitting in the living room when the temperature dropped suddenly and that familiar creaking started again, this time coming from just down the hall. I turned, and there she was, an elderly woman, sitting in the chair, rocking slowly. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were fixed on me, expressionless. For a moment, all I could do was stare, my body frozen in shock. Then, she spoke, her voice a whisper that echoed through the room. "This is my home." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't mean to intrude. I stammered. "I bought the house. I didn't know." She just kept rocking, her eyes locked on mine. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to leave the house and never come back. But I felt rooted to the spot, like she was holding me there with just her stare. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I went over to the neighbor's house, an older man who had lived on the street for decades. When I described the woman, he nodded slowly. "That's Mrs. Callahan," he said. "She lived there her whole life. Passed away a few years back. That rocking chair was her favorite spot." I told him what I'd seen, and he wasn't surprised. She loved that house. Wouldn't surprise me if she's still keeping an eye on things. He paused, then added, "If you want my advice, don't try to get rid of the chair again. Just leave it be." So, I did. I moved the rocking chair upstairs, placing it in the corner of the living room. And strangely, things calmed down. The front door stayed locked. The air felt lighter. I'd still hear the occasional creak from the chair, but I'd look over and see her, Mrs. Callahan, just sitting quietly, rocking back and forth. She didn't seem angry, just there, watching, making sure her home was still in good hands. We've come to an understanding, I guess. I don't mess with her chair, and she doesn't mess with me. It's strange living with the presence of someone who isn't quite alive, but I've come to appreciate it. The house feels lived in, like it has a history that's still alive, still moving. It's no longer just my house, it's ours. My wife and I had just moved into our new home, a charming little place on the edge of town, with a big backyard that opened up into a thick patch of forest. We were thrilled. It was our first house together, and everything felt like a fresh start. That first night, we were exhausted from unpacking, so we decided to relax on the porch, soaking in the quiet. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. But as we were about to head inside, we heard something, a soft, crackling melody drifting from the backyard. It sounded like an old song, one of those scratchy, vintage tunes you'd hear on an ancient record player. We looked at each other, confused. There was no one around, no houses close enough for the sound to carry like that. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out into the yard, scanning the area. But there was nothing, no source for the music, just the trees swaying in the breeze. Eventually, the song faded away, and we shrugged it off, assuming it must have been some weird echo or a trick of the wind. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. The next night, it happened again, only this time the music was louder, clearer. It was the same old-fashioned tune, but now it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the yard, right near where the forest began. My wife and I exchanged nervous looks, and I decided to check it out again. This time, I spotted something, a small object lying in the grass. As I got closer, I realized it was an old radio, covered in dirt and rusted over, but somehow it was playing that eerie song. I was about to pick it up when my wife screamed from the porch. "Stop! Don't go any closer!" she shouted, her voice filled with panic. I froze, my hand inches from the radio. "There are people in the woods. They're watching us," she yelled. I whipped around, shining the flashlight toward the tree line. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. 3 figures standing perfectly still, their silhouettes just barely visible among the trees. They weren't moving, just watching. My heart pounded as I backed away, keeping the light fixed on the shadows. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their faces. "Get inside!" I yelled to my wife, and we both bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind us. We locked every window and called the police, feeling the weight of the silence outside pressing against the walls. When the police arrived, they combed through the yard and the woods with their flashlights, but they didn't find anything. The radio had gone silent, and the figures were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. One of the officers shrugged it off, saying it was probably just some local kids playing pranks. But I knew what I saw. Those figures weren't kids. They were too still, too deliberate. The police left, assuring us they'd keep an eye on the area, but that didn't do much to settle our nerves. My wife and I spent the rest of the night staring out the windows, half expecting the music to start again or the shadows to reappear among the trees. Even though they didn't come back, the feeling of being watched lingered. It felt like the house wasn't as safe as it had seemed when we first moved in. It's been weeks now, and while everything seems normal during the day, I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone here. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees, I swear I can still hear that haunting tune, just faintly, like it's waiting for the right moment to return. And every night, I find myself looking out into the darkness, wondering if those figures are out there, hiding just beyond the edge of the light. It was one of those nights where the wind howled and rain hammered against the windows, making the whole house creak. I was curled up on the couch, watching TV with my dog, Rocky, by my side. The storm had been going strong for hours, and every now and then, lightning would flash, lighting up the room for a split second. Rocky seemed fine at first, just dozing off as usual, but then he perked up, his ears standing straight. He started growling, a low, rumbling sound I'd never heard from him before. His eyes were locked on the far corner of the living room, which, as far as I could see, was completely empty. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked, trying to calm him down, but his growl only turned into barking. Loud, frantic barks that echoed over the thunder outside. He wasn't barking at nothing. Rocky was always a calm dog, never one to overreact, so when he kept at it, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check things out. As I moved closer to the corner, Rocky stuck by my side, his eyes never leaving that spot. But nothing was there, just shadows cast by the lightning. I was about to brush it off as him being spooked by the storm when he suddenly bolted toward the back door, barking even louder. I followed him out onto the porch, and that's when I noticed something moving in the garden, barely visible through the sheets of rain. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a branch blowing in the wind. But as I shined my flashlight through the downpour, I saw the figure of an older man, wandering aimlessly in the yard. He looked soaked, his clothes clinging to him, and he seemed lost, stumbling as he moved. I recognized him immediately, Mr. Hill, my elderly neighbor. He lived alone a few houses down, and I knew he sometimes went for walks, but never this late and definitely not in weather like this. I hurried out, calling his name as Rocky ran ahead, still barking, but now with a different, almost urgent tone. "Mr. Hill, are you all right?" I shouted over the wind. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and confused, like he didn't recognize where he was. I guided him back inside, Rocky by our side, nudging him gently as if he understood something was wrong. Mr. Hill's hands were cold and shaking, and he muttered about trying to find his way home. I wrapped him in a blanket, helped him sit on the couch, and called his family right away. They were relieved and said they'd be over as fast as they could. Apparently, he'd gone for his usual evening walk, got caught in the storm, and lost his way. If it hadn't been for Rocky's barking, I would have never known he was out there, alone in the cold. When his family arrived, they were grateful beyond words. They thanked me, but I knew the real credit belonged to Rocky. Without him, who knows how long Mr. Hill would have been out there in the storm. That night, as the thunder finally died down and I settled back onto the couch, I felt a wave of relief. Rocky lay beside me, calm again, his eyes tired but watchful. I scratched behind his ears, whispering, "Good boy." Rocky saved someone that night, and maybe even saved me from the guilt I would have felt if I hadn't found Mr. Hill. It's a comfort knowing I've got a dog who's not just loyal, but seems to know when something's wrong. Even now, when he barks, I pay attention. I know he's looking out for both of us. When I first bought the house, I was thrilled. It was exactly what I'd been looking for, a quiet place at the end of a cul-de-sac, with plenty of space and, most importantly, a sense of solitude. It felt like a fresh start. The first few weeks were normal. I settled in, set up the furniture, and started to make the place feel like home. But then I started hearing the noises. At first, it was just faint, a soft, shuffling sound coming from above. I thought it might be squirrels, or maybe even birds that had made a nest up in the attic. But as the days went on, the sounds became more frequent and louder. It wasn't just shuffling anymore. There were knocks and what sounded like nails scraping against wood. Every night, just as I was about to fall asleep, it would start again, echoing through the walls like a whisper. One night, the noises were so loud that I couldn't ignore them anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder as I climbed, and each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I stood in the doorway, shining my flashlight into the dark space. The attic was filled with old furniture and boxes left behind by the previous owners. I moved slowly, sweeping the light across the room, and that's when I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. A small, narrow door tucked into the corner, half hidden behind an old dresser. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved the dresser aside, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. My heart raced, and every instinct told me to leave it alone, to turn back. But I felt pulled like something was urging me forward. I stepped through, the stairs creaking beneath my feet as I descended. The air felt thick, and a musty smell filled my nose. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, hidden room. The walls were covered in scratches, deep and jagged, like someone or something had been clawing at them for years. That's when I saw her. She was crouched in the corner, her back to me, her hands frantically scraping against the wall. Her hair was long and tangled, and her skin had a sickly, pale glow to it. I could hear her muttering, a low, desperate whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you okay?" She froze, and the air grew even colder. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were empty, sunken pits, and her mouth twisted into a snarl. Her face was pale and stretched tight like skin pulled over bone. Before I could react, she lunged at me, her fingers clawing at the air between us. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, its beams spinning wildly as it hit the floor. Her hands were ice cold as they brushed against my arm, and I felt a sharp pain as her nails dug into my skin. I pushed her away and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, just sprinted out of the attic and slammed the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked myself in my bedroom, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. When the police arrived, I told them everything, but when they checked the attic, they found nothing. The small door was still there, but the room beyond was empty. No sign of the woman or the scratches on the walls. They assured me it must have been a bad dream, a trick of the mind brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But I knew better. Even after they left, I could still feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on the air. The house was different now. Every corner felt darker. Every noise seemed amplified. And every time I walked past the attic door, I felt a cold breeze brush against me, like she was waiting, watching. It didn't take long for me to make my decision. I couldn't stay there. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew she was still there, and I couldn't bear the thought of another encounter. I packed up my things and left, abandoning the house I had once been so excited about. Even now, I can still see her in my mind, the way she moved, the emptiness in her eyes. Sometimes, I wonder if she was tied to the house, some remnant of its past. Or maybe she followed me, waiting for the right moment to reappear. All I know is I won't be going back. The house is hers now. When I moved to a small town, I was looking for a fresh start, a place where I could finally find some peace. The house I found was perfect, a cozy cottage on a quiet street, surrounded by trees and the kind of stillness I hadn't experienced in years. At first, everything felt right. The neighbors were friendly, and the town had a slow, comforting rhythm to it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally relax. That changed one night. I was in bed, just drifting off when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but then it grew louder, footsteps moving across the porch. My heart started to pound as I listened, holding my breath. The sound shifted to the door, followed by a scraping noise, like someone jiggling the handle, trying to get in. I froze, barely daring to breathe, my mind racing through the possibilities. Was it an animal? Or maybe a neighbor needing help? But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those. The handle rattled again, harder this time. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and called the police. As I whispered my address, I could hear the heavy breathing on the other side of the door, the intruder pressing against it. I crept down the hallway, peeking through a small crack in the curtains. The porch light cast long shadows, but I could make out a figure, a man, tall and stocky, his face hidden by a hood. He kept trying the door, growing more frustrated. Within minutes, the police arrived, lights flashing as they pulled into the driveway. The man bolted, disappearing into the trees behind the house. The officers searched the area, but found nothing. They reassured me that it was probably just someone passing through, but their words didn't comfort me. I knew what I had heard. He wasn't just passing through. He had wanted to get in. For a few days, things were quiet again. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing, but every creak in the house made me jump. I kept the curtains closed, the doors locked, and double-checked every window before bed. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like there were eyes on me even when I was alone. Then, one evening, as I was making dinner, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw him again. He was standing in the middle of the garden, just staring at the house. The same man, his hood pulled up, his posture tense. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, calling the police for the second time. This time, they arrived quickly and caught him before he could run. I watched from the window as they handcuffed him and led him to the squad car. I felt a wave of relief, thinking it was finally over, but then I noticed the way he looked back at the house, his eyes cold and distant. Even as they put him in the car, he didn't fight. He just stared like he was memorizing every detail, every inch of the place. Later, one of the officers stopped by to update me. They had taken the man in for questioning, but he refused to explain why he had been there or what he wanted. No ID, no explanation, nothing. He didn't say a word. They searched his belongings, but found nothing suspicious. It was like he was a ghost, no history, no trace. I asked the officer what would happen next, and he said they would hold him for as long as they could, but without any charges, they couldn't keep him forever. "We'll keep an eye on the area," he said, but the words felt empty. The man's silence left a hole of uncertainty that nothing could fill. I didn't know who he was, why he'd been trying to get into my house, or why he'd come back. And not knowing was the worst part. Now, every night, I sit by the window, waiting for the darkness to close in, half expecting to see his shadow appear again. I keep the doors locked, and every time the wind rattles the windows, my heart skips a beat. The quiet that once brought me peace now feels like a trap, too still, too silent, like the calm before something terrible. I don't know what he wanted, but the look in his eyes, the silence, it all makes me feel like it's not over. Like it's only a matter of time before he returns, and this time, I might not be so lucky. When my wife and I moved into our newly built house, everything seemed perfect. The smell of fresh paint, the shine of untouched floors, everything was exactly as we had imagined. We had saved up for years to build this place, and it felt like a dream come true. The first few days passed peacefully as we settled in, hanging pictures and arranging furniture. But then, on the third night, things took a strange turn. We were getting ready for bed when we heard it, a soft voice crackling through the intercom system. At first, it was hard to make out, just a faint whisper, but it sent a chill through me. My wife and I exchanged uneasy looks as we moved closer to the device. The voice repeated itself, clearer this time. "Let me in." The hair on my arm stood up, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Who's out there?" I asked, pressing the button. No answer. We checked the camera feed from the doorbell and the driveway, but the screen showed nothing, just the empty porch, lit by the soft glow of our outdoor lights. We thought maybe it was some kind of glitch, maybe interference from a neighbor's device. We brushed it off and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night it happened again. The voice came through, soft at first, but persistent. "Please, let me in." This time it felt more urgent, like someone was pleading. My wife's face went pale as she gripped my arm. We checked the cameras again, nothing. The porch was still empty, the yard quiet. Only the shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. I went outside, flashlight in hand, and circled the property, but there wasn't a single person in sight. Back inside, we sat in the living room, staring at the intercom system like it was some kind of enemy. The voice echoed through my mind long after it had faded. That night, I barely slept, my ears tuned to every creak and groan of the house, half expecting to hear the whisper again. On the third night, things escalated. We were in bed when the intercom crackled to life again, but this time, the voice was louder, insistent. "Let me in, please." It sounded like it was right outside our door. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline rushing through me, and checked the cameras, still nothing. But then, the whispering grew louder, and it wasn't just coming from the intercom anymore. It was echoing from the walls, as if the voice had seeped into every room. My wife was trembling, her eyes wide. "It's coming from inside," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I grabbed my phone and called a technician, telling him something was wrong with our system. He agreed to come out the next morning. We stayed up all night, huddled together, the whispers continuing to drift through the house like a breeze you couldn't see or feel. The next day, the technician arrived. I was on edge, desperate for answers, hoping he'd find some loose wire or a malfunction that would explain everything. But after a long inspection, he called us into the living room, his face serious. "There's no power running to the intercom system," he said. "It's completely disconnected. It shouldn't be able to transmit anything, let alone whispers." My blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" I asked, feeling the weight of his words settle in. He nodded, his expression grim. "I'm certain. This system has never been active." The technician left, shaking his head, and I stood there, staring at the intercom. My wife and I exchanged a look, one of fear, but also of silent understanding. Whatever was in our house, it wasn't something we could explain away with faulty wiring or interference. That night, we unplugged the intercom, but the silence that followed was somehow worse, like it was just waiting for the right moment to start again. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting just outside the walls. Sometimes when the house is quiet, I still think I hear the faintest whisper, like a plea that never really stopped. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 9 scary Netflix and chill horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.